My mother-in-law told my 7-year-old son that his mother was just a woman who files paperwork for the army. And 40 minutes later, I was standing in a Fayetteville courtroom, listening to a Bronze Star citation with my name on it, read out loud for the first time in 11 years. 19 years of service. Rank of Major. $211,000 a year. I never touched, because I signed it straight into an account my husband later drained down to $4.12. If you've ever been underestimated by the people who share your dinner table, comment where you're watching from right now. And if you've ever had someone mistake your silence for weakness, hit subscribe before this gets good, because it's about to get very, very good. Loop 1 started on a Tuesday in March, when a process server in a cheap grey suit knocked on the door of a house I paid the mortgage on and handed me papers I hadn't seen coming, a divorce filing, an emergency custody motion, and a request that the court order a psychiatric evaluation of me before I could see my son unsupervised. Loop 2 started 4 years earlier, in a hotel room in Lyon, when I overheard my husband's mother describe me to a cousin as the American nurse Julien picked up in Germany, and he stood 2 feet away and said nothing. Loop 3 started that same Tuesday afternoon, in a storage unit off Bragg Boulevard, when I put my hand on a sealed manila envelope, stamped with a classification marking I hadn't opened since the day I was told to forget what was inside it, and I understood that the only way to end this quietly was to end it loudly instead. I met Julien Moreau in Stuttgart in the spring I turned 29, at a NATO liaison reception I attended in Class A's, because I'd come straight from a briefing I couldn't discuss with anyone in that ballroom, including him. He told people later that we met at a work event, which was true, the way a photograph is true, if you crop out everyone standing in it. I was a captain then, 6 years into a career that had already taken me through a signals intelligence tour in Kandahar province and into a classified human intelligence billet that didn't exist on any organizational chart his family could look up. Julien worked, or said he worked, as a partner at a mid-sized asset management firm in Lyon, founded by his mother's brother. What that actually meant, I learned over the better part of a decade, was that he answered phones for his uncle and signed his name to reports other people wrote, and that the word partner in his family functioned less as a job title and more as a costume that got handed down. His mother, Colette Moreau, decided what I was within about 90 seconds of meeting me, at a dinner in a restaurant on the Presqu'île, with white tablecloths and a wine list longer than my last deployment order. She asked, in English, slowly, as if I might need the extra time, whether the American Army let women do the typing now. I told her, in French, at normal speed, that I did signals analysis, and she smiled the way you smile at a dog that has performed an unimpressive trick, and switched back to French for the rest of the meal, so that I would need to keep translating for myself, while everyone else ate. That was the pattern for 11 years. She never raised her voice. She never needed to. Contempt delivered slowly, in a language you have to work to keep up with, does more damage than contempt shouted, because you can never quite prove it happened. We married in a courthouse in Stuttgart, 8 months after we met, mostly because my next set of orders had a date on them, and Julien didn't want to be left behind as the boyfriend. I was pregnant with our son, Mathieu, within the year, and I gave birth to him in a military hospital in Landstuhl, while Julien was in Lyon for what he called a critical filing deadline, a phrase I would hear roughly 40 more times over the following decade, whenever something in his family required his physical presence, and something in mine did not. My own mother flew from Ohio to sit in that delivery room. Colette sent a card. It congratulated me, in French, on giving the family un héritier, an heir, as though I had performed a service rather than delivered a child, and I remember reading it in a hospital gown at 2 in the morning, and thinking, not for the last time, that I had married into a household that valued me exactly as much as I was useful, and not 1 gram more. The classified work never stopped being classified, which meant that for 11 years the truest and hardest parts of my life were legally unavailable to explain to the people I lived among. When Julien's associates asked what I did, He answered for me before I could open my mouth. Elena does something with paperwork for the army. Some kind of admin role, very stable. I let it stand. At first, because I genuinely couldn't correct it with specifics. And later, because correcting it had stopped being worth the argument that followed. What he was actually describing was a major with a top-secret/SCI clearance, who had run source networks in 2 provinces of Afghanistan, who had been awarded a Bronze Star with a Valor device for actions on the 9th of October during an ambush outside Zabul that I am still not permitted to describe in most rooms, and who had spent the last 3 years of her career as the senior intelligence liaison officer at a NATO command in Stuttgart, briefing 3-star generals twice a week. Admin role. I let a man who had never worn a uniform decide what 19 years of my life amounted to, and I let his mother repeat it at every family gathering until it calcified into a fact nobody in that house bothered to check. The financial arrangement, in hindsight, was the first crime, long before the legal one. In year 4 of the marriage, Julian proposed, reasonably, on paper, that we consolidate our accounts to simplify taxes across 2 countries, and that because his firm handled these things professionally, he would manage the joint investment account while I focused on the more demanding job, a phrase he used with a straight face about a 19-year army career that had already cost me 2 deployments and a set of hearing thresholds that would later matter more than either of us understood. I signed a power of attorney that let him execute transactions on that account without my countersignature, because I trusted him, and because I was, that particular month, in a classified planning cell, working 80-hour weeks, and genuinely did not have the bandwidth to argue about brokerage statements. Over the following 7 years, that account received my combat zone tax exclusion back pay, 4 re-enlistment and retention bonuses, totaling $61,000, and the survivor benefit premium withholdings we'd elected together. By the time I finally pulled a full statement myself, in February, the account that should have held roughly $340,000 held $4.12, and the transaction history showed 11 wire transfers over 3 years to an account in Camille Fabron's name that I had never heard until that afternoon. Camille Fabron entered the picture formally, as far as I know, about 3 years before I found those transfers, though I now believe she'd been there considerably longer. She described herself as an art consultant for 2 galleries in Lyon's Croix-Rousse district, 29 years old, and possessed of the specific brand of professional confidence that mistakes vocabulary for expertise. She used the word provenance in ordinary conversation the way other people use the word actually, and she had a habit, whenever I mentioned anything about my army career, of tilting her head slightly and saying, "Bien sûr, of course," in a tone that closed the subject rather than opened it. She met Mathieu twice before I knew who she was, both times introduced to him by his grandmother as Papa's colleague, and both times, according to my son, Colette told him afterward that Camille was someone who actually has time for this family, a sentence a 7-year-old should never be handed as a weapon against his own mother, but which Colette handed him anyway, twice, with a smile. Etienne Roussel, Julien's divorce attorney, I met for the first time across a mediation table in April, in a conference room in downtown Fayetteville that smelled like burnt coffee and printer toner. He had the specific, performative arrogance of a man who has read the opposing party's file exactly once and decided he already understands the whole case. He opened by informing me, as though it were a settled medical fact, rather than an allegation invented 3 weeks earlier, that I suffered from combat-related psychological instability that made unsupervised custody a documented risk to the minor child, and he said it while sliding across the table a report authored by a psychiatrist who had never once examined me, based entirely on a declaration submitted by Julien and co-signed by his mother. Roussel's entire strategy, repeated across 4 separate filings that spring, was to take my classified silence, the thing I legally could not explain, and dress it up in court as evidence of something broken in me, rather than something protected by federal law. He was good at his job. His job was cruelty wearing a law degree. The specific accusation Roussel's filing leaned on hardest was that I was malingering, his word, printed in a court document, regarding a service-connected condition I had been formally rated for by the VA 2 years earlier. A mild traumatic brain injury and residual vestibular damage from the same October 9th incident that earned me the Bronze Star, along with a seizure disorder that had put me in an emergency room in Fayetteville exactly once, 8 months before the divorce filing, after I collapsed in a grocery store parking lot in front of witnesses, an ambulance crew, and a security camera whose footage timestamp would matter a great deal later. Colette's sworn declaration, filed the same week, stated that she had personally observed me exaggerate symptoms for sympathy on at least 3 occasions during visits to Lyon, none of which she specified by date, because none of them, as it turned out, had actually happened during any visit she'd made. I want to be precise about what I did with all of this, because precision is the only thing I have ever fully controlled. I did not scream, I did not call Colette to argue about her declaration, and I did not call Camille at all. I drove, the same week the filing arrived, to a storage facility on Bragg Boulevard I had rented under my maiden name 11 years earlier, before Julienne and I married, and I put my hand on a sealed manila envelope I had been legally instructed, in writing, in 2015, never to open outside a secure facility, unless the classification authority formally released it. An envelope containing the full after-action packet from October 9th, the sworn statements of the 6 soldiers I pulled out of that ambush, and a personnel action recommending me for a decoration that had been quietly downgraded twice by officers more comfortable giving medals to men. I did not open it that day. I called the one number in it that still worked. That number belonged to Brigadier General retired Patricia Hale, who had been my battalion commander in Kandahar, and who had signed the original recommendation before it went up the chain and came back smaller. I told her, for the first time in 11 years, what my marriage had turned into: the divorce, the custody motion, the malingering accusation, the $4.12. General Hale was quiet for a long moment, and then she said the only sentence I needed to hear that week. "Elena, I have spent 11 years wondering why you let people believe you did paperwork. Let's stop wondering, and let's get you a lawyer who already knows what you actually are." The lawyer General Hale sent me to was Colonel, retired, Frank Whitmore, 61 years old, a former Judge Advocate General officer, who had spent 26 years prosecuting and defending cases inside the Army, before retiring into family law. Specifically, he told me at our first meeting, because civilian courts get military service wrong in ways that ruin people, and I got tired of watching it happen from the outside. Whitmore read Roussel's malingering filing twice, set it down on the table between us, and said, "This isn't a custody strategy. This is a man betting that you'll never let a court see who you actually served as, because you've spent your whole marriage letting his family define you smaller than that. He's betting on your silence. We're going to spend the next 4 months unbetting that." The second informal ally in this story was my younger brother, Daniel, 31, an Army veteran himself, with 2 tours in his own record, who flew from Ohio the week the filing landed and stayed in a rented apartment 11 minutes from my house for the rest of the case. Not to argue any point of law, but to sit with Mathieu on the nights I had depositions, to make sure I ate on the days I forgot, and to say, more than once, the only kind of thing a brother says instead of legal advice: "I watched what that October did to you before I ever heard the word Bronze Star. I don't need a courtroom to know what you are, but I understand why you might need one." The double life I'd been living inside that marriage had a rhythm to it by then. One I could recite the way you recite a duty roster. Every visit to Lyon followed the same choreography. Colette would greet me at the door in French, switch to slower French once I answered correctly, and by dessert would be describing, to whichever cousin was visiting, l'américaine, and her petit travail au bureau, her little office job, while I sat holding a wine glass I'd stopped drinking from an hour earlier, because someone needed to drive Mathieu home sober-minded through unfamiliar streets. On the second such dinner that spring, 3 weeks before the divorce filing, Colette said the sentence that would matter more than she knew. Turning to Camille, who had by then been folded fully into the family table without any explanation offered to me, Colette said, in French, smiling, Elle n'a jamais été soldat, seulement secrétaire. She was never a soldier, only a secretary. And Camille laughed, and Julien, sitting between us, looked at his wineglass and said absolutely nothing, which by then was its own complete sentence. Camille's contribution to that same evening was to ask me, with the specific tilted head condescension I'd catalogued by then, whether I found it difficult, psychologically, to have spent my career doing something so administrative while men did the more meaningful parts. I told her, evenly, that I had once spent 6 hours in a ditch outside Zabul, directing casualty evacuation under fire for 6 soldiers, one of whom bled out in my arms before the helicopter reached us, and that I did not find paperwork particularly meaningful in comparison. No. Camille said bien sûr, and changed the subject to a gallery opening. Colette laughed softly, as if I had made a joke rather than told her, with total accuracy, the worst night of my professional life. I remember the specific weight of my dress uniform on the 2 occasions Julien allowed me to wear it to a family function. A wool blend that always felt heavier in Lyon's humidity than it ever had in Stuttgart. The fabric pulling at my shoulders under the ribbons, I never explained to anyone at that table, because nobody ever asked what a single one of them meant. Colette would look at the rack of them once, briefly, the way you glance at a stranger's bumper sticker, and then return to her wine. I kept a small spiral notebook in my jacket pocket during those years, the kind you can buy at any commissary for $2, and I wrote down, in shorthand only I could read, every sentence Colette, Julien, or Camille said that reduced 11 years of my service to something smaller than it was. By the time the divorce papers arrived, that notebook held 43 entries, dated, time-stamped, and specific, because I had learned a long time before that marriage that if you are ever going to need proof of a pattern, you had better start collecting it before you know you'll need it. There was a second dinner, 6 weeks after the secretary comment, at Colette's apartment on a rainy November evening that smelled like duck fat and candle wax, where Julien's uncle, the one who nominally employed him, asked me, not unkindly, what exactly a signals officer did all day, and for once, before I could answer, Julien answered for me again, saying Elena mostly handles communications logistics, scheduling that kind of thing, a description so aggressively small that even the uncle looked briefly confused, since scheduling did not obviously require a security clearance, a fact Julien had mentioned once, offhand, years earlier, and then apparently forgotten the implications of. I said nothing that night either. Matthew was 4, seated beside me in a booster chair, and I had decided long before that dinner that I would not turn my own marriage into a courtroom in front of my son before an actual courtroom made that decision for me. Roussel's second deposition of me, in May, was where the malingering strategy sharpened into something closer to cruelty by design. He produced, without warning, a printout of the grocery store parking lot security footage from my seizure 8 months earlier, and asked me, on the record, whether I had arranged to have the episode occur in a public location for documentary value in a future proceeding, a question so absurd on its face that Frank Whitmore had to physically place a hand on my forearm under the table to stop me from laughing in a deposition. I did not laugh. I said, calmly, that the timestamp on that footage was 8 months before any divorce filing existed, that the ambulance report was a public record he already had a copy of, and that I would be very interested to hear him explain, under oath, how a woman arranges a seizure disorder documented by the Department of Veterans Affairs 2 full years before she'd ever heard the name Camille Fabron. He moved to the next question. Whitmore wrote something in his notes that he later told me was simply the word later, underlined twice. The midpoint of this case, roughly 4 months in, arrived on a night I will describe exactly once and never again in detail, because some things deserve a single telling. Matthew called me at 9:40 on a Thursday from Julien's apartment, his voice small in a way I hadn't heard since he was 4, to tell me that grandmother Colette had told him, at dinner, that maman was sick in her head the same way soldiers get sick, and it wasn't safe for him to be alone with her anymore. My 7-year-old son asked me, on the phone, whether he was going to have to choose. I did not raise my voice. I told him the truth. I was legally permitted to tell a child that I was not sick, that I loved him more than any assignment I had ever been given, in or out of a uniform, and that grown-ups sometimes say frightening things to win arguments that have nothing to do with the child listening to them. Then I hung up, sat on my kitchen floor for 11 minutes by the clock on my microwave, and called Frank Whitmore at 9:51, and told him it was time to stop protecting the classified parts of my life and start using them. If you're still with me, if you've ever had someone use your own child as a move in a game you never agreed to play, hit that subscribe button now, because in about 4 minutes a courtroom is going to hear exactly who they were dealing with. What Frank Whitmore filed the following week was a formal request, routed through the Army's Office of the General Counsel and the relevant classification authority, to have specific portions of my October 9th after-action packet declassified for the limited purpose of a domestic relations proceeding, a process that normally takes the better part of a year, and which General Patricia Hale, using 29 years of institutional relationships, I did not fully appreciate until I watched her spend them on my behalf, compressed into 5 weeks, through what she described to me, dryly, as calling in every favor I have left, before I'm too dead to collect on the rest. Alongside that request, Whitmore filed a sworn affidavit from Hale herself, describing in specific, time-stamped, unclassifiable detail what she had personally witnessed me do on the 9th of October, and a second affidavit from a VA neurologist confirming, with medical certainty, that my seizure disorder was a documented, service-connected, physiologically verified condition entirely independent of any custody dispute. Dated, notably, using medical records that predated my marriage's collapse by a full 2 years. Loop B, the personal betrayal, closed 6 days before the hearing, and it closed uglier than I had let myself imagine. Whitmore's forensic accountant, examining the 11 wire transfers to Camille Fabron's account, found something Roussel apparently hadn't checked closely enough. 3 of those transfers had been authorized using an electronic signature on the joint power of attorney, dated to a week I could prove, through my own military travel orders, that I had been in a secure facility in Stuttgart with no access to a personal device, let alone a notarized document requiring my physical signature. The power of attorney Julian had used to justify 7 years of unilateral financial control contained, on its most recent renewal, a signature that was not mine. It was a passable forgery. It was still a forgery, and forensic document examiners do not care how passable a forgery is. I confronted Julian with that finding exactly once, the night before the hearing, on the phone, not because Whitmore recommended it. He explicitly told me not to, but because 11 years of marriage had earned me one unprofessional conversation before I let a courtroom finish the rest professionally. I asked him, directly, whether he had forged my signature to keep funding an account he was using to support another woman, while telling a judge I was mentally unfit to raise our son. He was quiet for 11 seconds. I counted them, the way I count everything, and then he said the truest sentence he'd offered me in a decade. You were never going to notice, Elena. You were always somewhere else. Somewhere you couldn't tell me about. I told him that not being able to tell him where I was had never once meant I wasn't paying attention to what he was doing where he was. Then I hung up, and I did not cry, because I had promised myself in that storage unit parking lot 3 months earlier that the crying, if there was going to be any, would happen after the verdict and not before it. I did not sleep the night before the hearing. Not out of fear exactly, but out of the same wired stillness I remembered from the hours before a dawn operation, lying flat on my back in a dark bedroom, counting the water stain on the ceiling, instead of counting sheep, running the sequence of the day in my head, the way I once ran mission timelines. Exhibit order, witness order, the exact paragraph of the after-action packet Whitmore intended to read first, for maximum effect. I pressed my Class A jacket myself at 4 in the morning rather than have it done, because there is a particular calm in doing a task with your own hands, the night before you need your hands to be steady, and I remember the smell of the steam off the iron, and the specific dry rustle of the ribbons as I pinned them, one at a time, into positions I hadn't needed to check in years, because my fingers still remembered them without my eyes. Matthew was asleep at Daniel's apartment. I called to check on him once, at 5:40, and Daniel told me he'd gone to bed asking whether Mummy's soldiers were coming to help her, a sentence that nearly undid the calm I'd spent 4 hours building, and which I taped, mentally, to the inside of my own resolve for the rest of that morning. The morning of the hearing, Cumberland County Family Court, Courtroom 4, smelled like cold coffee, floor polish, and the particular dry paper smell of a room that has processed 1,000 versions of the same argument. Judge Miriam Castellano, presiding, had a reputation Whitmore respected specifically because she was reputed to be allergic to theatrics and unusually attentive to documentary evidence, which meant, he told me, that this case would be won or lost entirely on what we could put on paper and under oath, not on how sympathetic either party managed to seem. The gallery that morning was fuller than either side had requested. General Hale had flown in personally rather than submit her affidavit remotely. 4 of the soldiers from my October 9th after-action packet had, on their own initiative and their own dime, driven or flown in from 3 different states to sit in that gallery in civilian clothes. And my brother Daniel sat 2 rows back with Mathieu's school photo in his jacket pocket, which he told me afterward he'd brought, in case I needed a reason to stay calm, though I don't think Daniel has ever needed a reason to stay calm in his life. Colette sat beside Julian, in a coat that cost more than my monthly VA disability payment. Camille sat 1 row back, close enough to matter, far enough to deny it if asked. Roussel opened by reading, almost verbatim, his malingering theory from the original filing, describing me to the court as a woman who has used the mystique of classified service to avoid ordinary scrutiny of her mental fitness. And it was, I will admit, an elegant sentence, delivered with the specific performative confidence I'd watched him wear across 4 months of depositions. Judge Castellano listened to the whole thing without interrupting, which Roussel clearly mistook for agreement, and which Whitmore had told me, correctly, was simply what a good judge does before she starts asking her own questions. The declassified portions of my after-action packet were read into the record by Whitmore, sentence by sentence, at Judge Castellano's direction, and the courtroom got very quiet, in a way courtrooms rarely get quiet, somewhere around the 3rd paragraph. When the record described a 29-year-old captain directing a casualty evacuation under sustained small arms fire for 6 wounded soldiers across a distance of roughly 400 meters, refusing medical evacuation for herself, despite a documented head injury sustained in the same engagement, and continuing to coordinate the extraction until the last soldier was aboard the final helicopter. General Hale, called to testify immediately after, did not raise her voice once. She said, evenly, looking directly at Julian and then at Colette, "I have signed a great many decoration recommendations in 29 years of service. I have never signed one I believed in more than the one this court is now looking at. Major Reyes Moreau did not do paperwork on October 9th. She did the reason. 41 men from that battalion are alive to have families of their own today." Then she said the sentence Whitmore and I had discussed privately the night before. The sentence built specifically to answer the one Colette had said at that dinner table 3 weeks before the filing. She was never just a secretary. I would know. I signed her enlistment paperwork myself, 20 years ago, and I have spent every year since watching her prove that paperwork wrong. Roussel attempted, briefly, to object to the relevance of combat testimony in a custody proceeding, and Judge Castellano overruled him with a single sentence that Whitmore later told me he intends to quote in every closing argument he writes for the rest of his career. "Counsel, you built your malingering theory on the premise that this woman has spent 11 years hiding something. The court would like to finish hearing what she was actually hiding before deciding whether that premise survives." The forensic document examiner testified next, walking the court through the forged signature on the power of attorney, with the specific, unhurried precision of a man who has done this exact demonstration in front of exactly this exact kind of shocked silence many times before, concluding that the signature dated to a period when travel records placed me in a secure facility overseas, with no physical access to any notary in the state of North Carolina. Julien, 3 seats away, put his face in his hands for the first time in 4 months of proceedings. I had watched him treat like a business negotiation. The chain reaction among the secondary antagonists happened in real time, in a way I had not fully predicted even after months of preparing for it. Colette, hearing the word forgery applied formally to her son's financial conduct, turned to Julien in the gallery and said, in French, at a volume she clearly believed was quieter than it actually was, "Tu m'as dit que c'était légal. You told me this was legal," a sentence that confirmed, in open court, on the record, that she had known about the account, and possibly about the forgery, well before that morning. Camille, seated 1 row back, stood up 11 minutes later during a recess and left the building entirely, and according to 2 of the soldiers seated near her, did not return for the remainder of the hearing. Roussel, for his part, requested a 10-minute recess with his client that both Whitmore and Judge Castellano granted, and from which Julien returned visibly different, quieter, grayer, a man doing arithmetic he should have done 4 months earlier. Judge Castellano's ruling, delivered that same afternoon, rather than reserved for a later date, granted me primary physical custody of Mathieu, with structured, supervised visitation for Julien, pending a full accounting of the drained account, referred the forged power of attorney to the district attorney's office for potential criminal review, and included, in the written order itself, a sentence I have read more times than I've read almost anything else in my adult life. The court finds the respondent's characterization of the petitioner as psychologically unfit to be unsupported by any credible evidence, and finds instead a pattern of financial and emotional conduct by the respondent and his family, designed to obscure the petitioner's documented service and exploit her legal inability to correct the record. 11 years, and a family court judge in Fayetteville, North Carolina, wrote down in a permanent order the sentence nobody in my husband's family had ever bothered to say out loud, that I had been exactly who I said I was, the entire time, and they had simply never checked. The months that followed moved the way consequences actually move, which is unevenly, and mostly without an audience. Julien was indicted, 5 months later, on 2 counts of financial exploitation and 1 count of forgery, related to the power of attorney, a case Whitmore told me will likely end in a plea and a restitution order rather than prison time, which he warned me not to be disappointed by, because the restitution order, structured as it was, guaranteed I would recover roughly $290,000 of the drained account over 4 years, secured against Julien's future earnings, which mattered considerably more to Mathieu's college fund than any sentence Julien served. Colette, after her open court admission that she had known about the account, was quietly excluded from her brother's asset management firm's board of family advisors, a consequence delivered not by any court, but by relatives of her own who had watched the hearing's local news coverage and drawn their own conclusions about her judgment. Camille's gallery employer, according to Daniel, who still has friends in Lyon from his own army days, declined to renew her consulting contract that same year, citing, vaguely, reputational considerations, a phrase I found almost funny, given how many times she'd used a similarly vague vocabulary to diminish me. Julien called me once, 8 months after the hearing, on a night Mathieu was staying with my brother, and said, without preamble, that he had spent those 8 months trying to understand why he'd never once asked me a real question about what I did overseas in 11 years of marriage, and that the honest answer he'd arrived at was that not asking had let him keep believing the version of me that was easiest to feel superior to. I told him that I appreciated the honesty. 4 years and 1 felony indictment later than it would have done either of us any good, and that Mathieu would need a father who showed up to supervised visitation on time, far more than he needed an apology delivered to me. He has, to his credit, shown up on time for 14 consecutive months. I do not know yet whether that adds up to reconciliation, or simply to the bare minimum finally being met, and I have stopped needing it to be one or the other, before I let Matthew have a relationship with his father on his own terms. What I have learned, sitting on the other side of all of it, is that being underestimated is not actually about what you're capable of. It's about what other people find convenient to believe, because the smaller version of you is easier to live alongside without ever having to ask a hard question. Colette never asked me a single real question about my service in 11 years, not because she couldn't have understood the answers, but because not asking let her keep the story she preferred. I let her keep it too, for longer than I should have, because correcting people you love costs more than staying quiet, right up until the day it costs you your son's custody instead. So I'll ask you the only question that actually matters here. How many people in your own life have you let believe the smaller, easier version of you, simply because correcting them felt like more trouble than it was worth? Somewhere in Lyon tonight, a woman who once told a room full of relatives that I was only a secretary is finding out exactly how much of her son's financial life she's about to be asked to account for under a French tax authority inquiry that started, quietly, the same week a North Carolina courthouse put my real service record on the public docket. And that story, the one about what happens when the lie follows the family across an ocean, is the one I'm telling you next. So if you've made it this far with me, you've already proven you want to see how far the truth actually travels once it starts moving. Subscribe now, because you already know you're not going anywhere until you find out.